What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the Raw Prospect Podcast. My name is Amy Nixon. Today is October 6th, 2022. NBA season is currently 13 days away, I believe. And we're going to be covering all you need to know. We're going to be doing NBA power rankings and giving you some overreactions to what we've seen so far in the preseason. But before we do that, joining me as always from Austin, Texas, the Stat King himself, Mr. Michael Wing. What's up?
It's October 6th. We are recording this, as Amy said, at 11:13 p.m. in the evening. And the University of Oklahoma and their football team still sucks. It will always suck. Anywho, it's Red River Week. We have to say that. We are required at the University of Texas to say that. But anywho, we are back for episode 125. We're halfway to 150, which is sort of insane. We'll be to 150 in no time. Before you know it, we'll be to 200 at the rate that we're going. It's such a busy time of year in sports. In fact, I think I might be overthinking this or forgetting about another time of year. But this time of year, especially this year, with the World Cup upcoming later in November, I think this time of year is my favorite time in sports. Because think about it. We get baseball playoffs. We're sort of now in the middle of the college football season, right? We're sort of getting into the heart of the college football season. We're trending that way in the NFL. We're getting into that time of year, October. We're heading quickly towards November. The late early part of the regular season where you find out a lot about these teams, who they are. You have the NBA starting. College basketball will be starting next month. We just have so much going on in the sports world. So it's one of my favorite times of year, October especially, with all the sports combined at once. And we have a lot on our plate here at the Raw Prospect Podcast. So today we're going to be doing NBA power rankings. Emmy and I, to save time, came up with a cumulative list, 10-1. We'll be going through that, giving you our initial thoughts on those teams' off seasons, but also their outlook for this season. More the off season part, because we haven't really covered that much. We'll be doing our projections for this upcoming season sooner rather than later. So keep an eye out for that. And at the end of the episode, we'll do some overreactions to what we've seen so far in the preseason. So why don't we just jump into our power rankings? I think it's best if we go 10-1.
Right.
We'll just go team by team.
Yeah. Starting with the Miami Heat at number 10. Team that forced a Game 7, went all the way to 7 games in the Eastern Conference Finals last year, was one Jimmy Butler three-pointer away from possibly going back to the finals 2 out of 3 years. If you look at it, outside looking in, it's easy to say, oh, they lost PJ Tucker, they lost a couple of guys, they got worse. But the thing about this team is the core of the roster is young enough to where they can improve and make up for that loss of PJ Tucker and some of those losses on the edges of the roster. If you look at a guy like Tyler Hero, I expect him to take a step forward this year. A guy who averaged 20 points per game last year, kind of under the radar, won Sixth Man of the Year. And then Bam Adebayo, a guy who, as much, crap as he gets for, not being aggressive offensively, if he just the talent is there. If he commits to being aggressive offensively, he can become a key scoring option for this team next to Jimmy Butler. So I'm still very high on this Miami Heat team. Relatively high compared to the general public, I believe. And they're still well coached. They still have Eric Spoelstra, one of the best coaches in the league, no doubt about it. Um, and I think at the very least, this will be a very tough regular season team simply because they always defend and they always, play smart basketball. They don't beat themselves.
Yeah, it's funny, sort of the outside perception of this Miami Heat basketball team, especially after an off season. Well, they didn't do a whole lot. They kept their guys in house. Um, you obviously lose a piece like PJ Tucker, which will have an impact, but I think some people are overreacting to that. He'll obviously, we're going to talk about the Sixers a little bit later. He'll obviously probably make a positive impact there, but it's funny. You look at the Heat, and they always seem to sort of shock everybody who covers the NBA. It's not that they're thought of as a bad team or anything, but they're absolutely not a bad team. They finished with the best record in the East last year. But it's just sort of like they execute on both ends of the floor. They're solid fundamentally. They're well coached. They always seem to find themselves atop the Eastern Conference. And people just seem to act surprised about like how they do it. But it's that culture. It's that core. Jimmy Butler, Bam Adebayo as your stars. Eric Spoelstra, who's I think established himself as not only one of the best coaches today, but a historically good coach.
Right.
And you look at what they had to suffer through last season. The health of this team was they were never really fully healthy. Butler missed 25 games. Adebayo missed 26 games. Kyle Lowry missed 19 games. Tyler Hero missed 16 games. They were all absent for significant amounts of times, but they just kept plugging away. And they found some really good rotation gems in the process that I think will play a critical role on this year's team. Obviously, we have to start by talking about Bam Adebayo. When he plays, he looks like an NBA Defensive Player of the Year candidate. Butler, for the most part, at the end of last year, looked like an end of the MVP ballot type player. Hero won Sixth Man of the Year, as you mentioned, averaging almost 21 points off the bench. But in the process of all those injuries and Duncan Robinson's struggles, which is another topic we can talk about, they found guys like Max Strus and Gabe Vincent and Caleb Martin. And I think those guys are going to be really critical in how much this year. But if you look at the core, from Butler to Adebayo to Tyler Hero, to even Kyle Lowry, a guy who can still get it done at a fairly high level for his age and what he is at this point in his career, they didn't get better this offseason, but they certainly didn't get a whole lot worse. And I still think they're a team to be reckoned with, not only in the regular season, but come postseason time, because they know who they are, and they're going to play hard each and every possession. And they're going to play defense too. So I still like the Heat. I think they're a playoff team in the Eastern Conference, but we'll certainly do more projecting at a later date. Is there anything you want to add on the Heat?
Well, you mentioned Max Strus and Gabe Vincent. I just want to add on to the point that they always find gems, late in the like every single season. There's a new guy in this rotation that surprises people. Last year it was Gabe Vincent and Max Strus. A few years ago it was Duncan Robinson, so on and so forth. So the reason why this team continues to surprise, I think it's just some of these bench players. I think going into each season, people just don't know, like they just don't know them. But clearly, they have a system in place in terms of identifying talent, and what they have going there really works. So I'd expect them to be a top 5 team in the East this season, and I think anything less than that would be a major disappointment.
I agree. So with that, we'll move swiftly. Our number 9 team is going to be your team, the Dallas Mavericks. So why don't you start us off?
Yeah. The feeling around, Mavericks fans right now is just the elephant in the room is how are the Mavericks going to adjust without Jalen Brunson? For a long time, this Mavericks team, they were just looking for that third ball handler, and then they found that. They added Spencer Dinwiddie, and that made a big difference. But then now we're right back to square one. Now we just have Luka and Dinwiddie, and we still, have that question about that third guy, and whether it be, the kid we drafted, Jaden Hardy, or possibly someone who steps up, like Frank Ntilikina, whatever the case may be. I just think that might be the deciding factor for this team because Luka, as we've seen, has been consistently, he misses about 10 to 15 games per season just because of his style of play. He attacks the basket a lot, takes a lot of punishment. That's just part of the deal. So in order to, I don't want to say survive, but stay afloat in those games, I think a third ball handler has to step up. But beyond that, the Mavericks added Christian Wood. I think that was a risk worth taking. The word from the Mavericks is that he'll be coming off the bench as a sixth man. I really like him in that role. I think as long as he buys in on the defensive end, he'll do a lot of good for this team. This is a team that over the last few years has really lacked front court scoring. They've basically had no front court scoring. It's been a mix of Dwight Powell, Maxi Kleba, and hodgepodge centers thrown around here and there. But I really do think the improvements that were made on the roster were really in the front court. We added Christian Wood. We added JaVale McGee, two guys who I think will really make a big impact on the roster and can contribute in the pick and roll game with Luka as well. Pick and roll and pick and pop for Christian Wood's case, of course. So I feel good about this Mavericks team, but it's a really tough Western Conference. It's going to be a battle. Just from a fan perspective, I'm a little bit nervous about how deep this conference is because you lose a couple games in a row, lose 3 games in a row, and all of a sudden you blink and you're in the play-in. So it's really going to be a battle the whole season. And with Luka, I just think we'll still be able to be a top 5 seed even with the loss of Jalen Brunson.
It's crazy because if you think back to last year, remember early on in the season where Luka Doncic was essentially getting body shamed. Essentially, he was actually called out on a December 7th TNT broadcast where the Mavericks were playing the Nets, and Reggie Miller actually called him out for being out of shape on live television. The Mavericks lost that game. They dropped to 11-12 on the young season. And, it took Doncic a while to get back into form, to get back into shape. But once he did, the Mavericks absolutely, terrorized the league. On December 29th, they were 16-18. But they went on to win the next 10 of their next 11 games. And they caught fire. Over the last 48 games of last year, they absolutely terrorized the entire NBA, going 36-12 in their final 48 games. You think back to what the team was last year. Jason Kidd did a really good job, I thought, in his first year as head coach.
Right.
He had them playing good team defense. They were one of the better defensive teams in the league at most times. They were also a good rebounding team. And, hell, if Doncic didn't come in, so out of shape, he may have won the MVP. He could have very well won the MVP because he was just that good down the stretch and in the playoffs. I think Jason Kidd even thanked Reggie Miller, according to The Athletic, for calling out Luka Doncic because it probably motivated him. They, of course, traded Porzingis to Washington. That got them Spencer Dinwiddie and Davis Bertans for some additional shooting. They really relied on their defense, perimeter shooting, and that guard combination, the backcourt combination of Doncic, Dinwiddie, and Jalen Brunson to carry them, and it worked. They got to the Western Conference Finals. They beat Utah. They made a statement against that Phoenix Suns team, if you remember, in that semifinal series. And then they just eventually just ran out of steam against the Golden State Warriors team that when Draymond Green was on the floor was one of the better defensive teams we had seen in a long time. So they got all the way to the Western Conference Finals and a new head coach that if you think back to last year when we were having these conversations, you had and I had a lot of questions about Jason Kidd as the head coach, but he proved us wrong. And I think this year's team, if you look at what they did, adding, Christian Wood and JaVale McGee in the front court, I really like it. I think that, the last time JaVale McGee played for Dallas, I think it was a 3-year – no, this year's contract, the contract he signed was a 3-year, $17.2 million deal. They did trade Boban Marjanovic to Houston, and they signed Maxi Kleber to a contract extension, 3 years, $33 million. But the last time McGee played for Dallas, he wasn't really the veteran presence, the veteran that this team wanted him to be. Since then, he's been, if you think about it, he's been part of 2 title-winning teams, the Lakers and the Warriors. He's grown up a lot, and he's become a great presence. I think he'll provide great value for that big man rotation. You have Kleber, who can shoot it from the outside, and then Wood, who ever since Harden left Houston, didn't really have that guard that he could play off of. And I think Luka Doncic will do a really good job of elevating his game. So it's hard to say if the Mavericks got better this offseason, but I think they got more balanced.
Right.
And I think that in itself could make them a better team, especially come playoff time, because they have more depth now in that front court.
Right.
So, and look, I think Dinwiddie, can actually replace a lot of what Brunson did, but the depth there is certainly concerning now that you don't have Jalen Brunson. But I just think the key will be making sure that he looks down the outside shots at a consistent clip. And then I'm interested to see what Tim Hardaway is going to look like in his return as well.
Right. Yeah.
But I do like Mavericks roster overall. Obviously, you have a guy like Luka who's going to get you, to a certain point in himself. But yeah, I think this offseason can sort of be summated by the Mavericks got more balanced and they got the place they needed to get better. So yeah, I like what the Mavericks did this offseason.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, overall, I'd say it was a success. Even though we kind of had to play with the cards that were dealt to us with losing Jalen Brunson, but we'll move right along here. The next team, let me see. Where's my phone?
I think it's the Memphis Grizzlies. So why don't you start us off with Memphis?
Right. Yeah. Memphis. Man, they continue to build through the draft. They're one of the more impressive organizations in the NBA. And one of the things people don't talk about with Memphis is just how young they are in their rotation. If you look at a guy for like Zaire Williams, for example, a guy who they picked in the first round last year, was a rookie last year, played about 15 to 16 minutes per game, got valuable, playoff experience. I think this team will continue to grow together. all throughout their roster. It's a lot of young talent, obviously led by John Morant and Jaren Jackson Jr. But beyond that, I just really like how they compete. They're a very, what's the right word? They talk a lot of trash. They're confident. They have a lot of, you know, energy. They play with a certain swagger about them that I really like. And their toughness, their grit, I think um, it's hard to underrate that. It's a very important, you know, quality to have as a team. And this offseason, they didn't do anything, overly special. They didn't, make any splash moves. But they were in some rumors with Kevin Durant, and ultimately they brought everybody back. Other than the one trade they made was, I believe they traded their backup point guard to Philadelphia. I believe I can't remember his name at the moment, but the point being is this team is still deep. They have another year of experience under their belt, valuable playoff experience as well, and I think this team could very well be, you know, the number one seed in the West, possibly. I'm really high on them in the regular season. We'll see what happens in the playoffs, but as long as they stay healthy, they're always a tough out in the regular season.
Yeah, they're going to be really good in the regular season. They're going to win a lot of games. You look at what they did last year, and it was only the start of it. Finished with the conference's second best record, 56-26. Really, I think overachieved in a lot of people's eyes. They pushed the Golden State Warriors to 6 games in the conference semifinals. They were really good in a lot of areas. In fact, they ranked 4th in offensive rating and 6th in defensive rating. They were only one of 4 teams with Boston, Phoenix, and Utah to rank last season in the top 10 in both offensive rating and defensive rating. They also led the league in shots, rebounds, offensive boards, steals, and blocks, as well as points, second chance points, and fast break points. That's a lot of categories to lead the league in. They also ranked 2nd in field goals and scoring average and 3rd in pace. So they really have they can play in a bunch of different ways. I think my main question is obviously, and it seems it comes back to this too often, how are they going to plug Jaren Jackson Jr.'s spot until he comes back from his injury? He had surgery on his foot back in June. They laid out a recovery timeline of 4 to 6 months. So there's a void in that starting lineup, most dramatically on the defensive side of the floor. But I do think they have capable people that can fill that role until Jaren Jackson Jr. is able to get back. I really like Zaire Williams, as you mentioned. I think Xavier Tillman, with what he did and how he was developed back at Michigan State to where he is now, is another capable guy that can give them some minutes, some interior scoring, some shooting as well, and some rim protection. And look, John Morant had obviously another great year, was an MVP candidate in some people's eyes. They gave him the max extension that he deserved, 5 years, $231 million. And Desmond Bane, I think, is going to continue to grow. But Dylan Brooks, I think, is my X factor on this team. Injuries limited him to just 32 games last year. But look, he scored at an efficient clip when he did play last year. 24 points per 36 minutes, shooting a career best 43% from the field. So I like obviously you have Steven Adams still there. So I like what this team is. I think they have some depth. You look at their bench, Brandon Clark, I think is so valuable off the bench. He's going to be, I think, going to take another step. Tyus Jones, and as I said, Zaire Williams and Xavier Tillman. They have that injection of youth, but they also have that veteran presence. They're good defensively. They're going to play hard under a coach that I really like in Taylor Jenkins. And we'll just have to see how they fare over the first month or two of the season when they're missing Jaren Jr. But this is a team that, if you remember, has actually found ways to win and be better when they're missing their best players. And that's one of the qualities that I like about them. I think they're going to continue to grow. I'm not sure they're going to get to 56 wins again, just because I look at the landscape of the West. Denver's going to be healthier. The Clippers are obviously back healthy. The West Conference is stacked, as we talk about every year, but I think this year more than ever. And so I'm not sure they get to 56 wins, but they'll still be top 4 seed in the West, probably, as long as Jaw stays healthy. And they're going to be tough out in the playoffs.
Right. Yeah, 100%. Okay, moving right along, we have the Phoenix Suns at number 7. I'll let you start off.
Why don't you go ahead? I got to pull something up real fast.
Yeah. Okay. Phoenix, they were nothing short of incredible during the regular season. I mean, you can't underrate how good they were in the regular season. Just because of how things ended doesn't take away anything they achieved in the regular season. And I know it doesn't feel that way because it feels like it was a major letdown. And it definitely was a bit of a letdown. But this team is still extremely deep at every position group. Obviously, there is that rumor that Jay Crowder is going to be requesting a trade, but we'll see what happens with that. Until further notice, they still have great depth at all the wing positions as well. The question for me with the Suns is outside of Chris Paul and Devin Booker creating, where are they going to get their points? And obviously, some of that comes in the flow of the offense with the ball movement, but to me, it really just comes down to the fourth quarter. You get the flow of the offense going first 3 quarters, and that's great. You can get those open looks. But in the fourth quarter, when things tighten up, they really do rely a lot on Chris Paul and Devin Booker to just create all of their offense. That came back to bite them majorly in the playoffs when Dallas loaded up their defense on those 2 guys. So that's a big question for me. I think the good news for them is they still do have DeAndre Ayton, and he could be the answer to that question depending on what type of step he took in the offseason. He's still young. He still has room to grow as a player, obviously, former number 1 overall pick. But I think I worry about this team because of what I've just said, and also because some of the vibes that I've gotten out of that organization at the moment. Obviously, the stuff with Robert Sarver is not great. That suspension, and obviously he's going to be selling the team. But also, if you guys have been paying attention to some of the press conferences from the Phoenix Suns, it's been nothing short of awkward, to say the least. I mean, even the one I point to is obviously the DeAndre Ayton interview where the reporter asked him, "How did you react to your new big contract?" And he was like, "I was happy," with a completely straight face. And may just be reading into it too much, but I think they're going to be good this season. But I don't know. I just question how far they can go until they trade for another creator.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, last year, unbelievable in the regular season. They actually, 64-18, unbelievable regular season. Sort of a disappointing playoff run, not really what we expected. They got pushed to the brink in the first round against New Orleans Pelicans team that we'll hopefully get to talk a lot about. A team I'm really excited about this upcoming season
Right.
in our Western Conference preview. That'll be sooner rather than later. And then, obviously taking a 2-0 lead on the Mavericks, but then the Mavericks storm back. They have that embarrassing Game 7 in Phoenix where they get blown out by Dallas, a team that was just on a mission, I think. And obviously, it seems every single time we call into question how healthy is this team going to be and where are they going to get, as you said, where's the shot creation going to come from if it's not Chris Paul and this is not Devin Booker? And against really good defensive teams, what you have at the top of the Western Conference, Golden State, with obviously Clay back and healthy, teams that we've talked about, the Clippers now with the wing defenders that they have, even a team like, the Grizzlies. So that's really the question. I'm also sort of excited to see how, DeAndre Ayton looks early on. I think I had the same thought you have. I think the vibes are sort of off there, but hopefully he can sort of separate the off-court shenanigans from the on-court business side of basketball and just go help this team win games. I think it's unfair to expect this team to be as good as they were last year in the regular season, but I think that could actually be a good thing. I think they really pushed it too hard in the regular season, and this could be 2020 hindsight, but I think it'll be better for them to just kind of take a load off. They don't really have to try as hard. I like their team, especially when you look at their starting lineup. Chris Paul, even though he's 37 years old, led the NBA in assists. It's just that playmaker, facilitator, the leader, was really good defensively, a disruptor, number 2 in steals per game, but obviously was slowed in the playoffs by some nagging injuries. Devin Booker, who was first-time All-NBA, continues to improve his playmaking ability and efficiency. I think he'll, if this Phoenix team is to go where they want to go, Devin Booker could possibly be a sleeper MVP candidate.
Right.
Mikal Bridges is maybe my favorite player on this team just because he's young, is really good at defense. He's bought into the system that Monty Williams is preaching in Phoenix. He's coming off a career high 14 points per game, and I only expect him to get better and expand his game offensively. Maybe there's an answer that lies there. Cam Johnson at the 4, I think, he's a player I watched a lot of at Carolina. I've sort of watched his development and maturation in the NBA. His three-point shooting, well, obviously, an ability to stretch the 4, I think will be good. And then Ayton, who I just mentioned, really looking for that consistency that we sort of saw last season, but we need to see it. We need to see more of it. Campaign off the bench was slowed by injuries last year. Again, that's a nagging theme with this team. And he sort of took a step back from his previous season, so maybe he plays better this year. If he does, that'd be huge for them.
Right.
I think losing JaVale McGee, it's not going to be great, but they did replace him with Bismack Biyombo in the offseason. We'll see how that works out. And then Torrey Craig was obviously a key cog on this team last year, but struggled coming back mid-season from an injury, maybe with a full off season and some health there. I think they're a good team. I just don't know, number one, how healthy they're going to be come postseason time, what that looks like in the regular season, and then DeAndre Ayton and the shot creation thing that you talked about. So we'll see. Monty Williams will have him coached up, ready to play. Chris Paul and Devin Booker is an elite backcourt. But there are questions, and we'll just have to see.
Right. Okay. Moving on to our number 6 team. It's going to be the Denver Nuggets, a team that's coming back healthy. We mentioned earlier, bringing back Jamal Murray, bringing back Michael Porter Jr. But another thing that people aren't talking about is they brought in some key pieces in this offseason as well to fill some holes in this roster that really needed to be filled. Specifically, wing defense, 3-and-D guy like KCP to come in, shoot the three, will work well as an off-ball player. Really moves well off ball, and that will be perfect next to Jokic. Um, as well as bringing in, I believe they brought in a backup point guard. Can't think of his name right now. I apologize for that, guys. But this Nuggets team, people are very high on this Nuggets team, and for good reason. I mean, Jokic had arguably one of the most efficient and impressive seasons of all times in terms of carrying that team that really was not good, not good at all. And he got the most out of that team, led them to the 6th seed in the West, and obviously won the MVP. And some of that load on his shoulders won't be as much. He won't have to be asked to carry everything, every single possession, which will be good. Keep the players fresh. And it seemed like at the end of last year, Jokic was gassed. That's one of the things people didn't really bring up. He had been doing everything for that team all year, and it just really looked like he was completely out of energy at the end there. But this team, they defend well with Mike Malone and that system they have. Last year, obviously, they didn't defend as good because they didn't have their key guys. But bringing their guys back, bringing in some wing defense, I think they're ready to make a push in the Western Conference. I think there's going to be some growing pains. Obviously, bringing back as big of a piece offensively as Jamal Murray is, and also Michael Porter Jr. as well. I think there will be a transition period, kind of getting them back acclimated to get everything flowing again. But I think 30 games into the year, that we'll really start to see them click.
Yeah, I think this Nuggets team is fascinating. But I just want to sort of go position by position. You talked about the point guard spot. Obviously, last year they were dealing with a tough situation. Monte Morris as their starting point guard with Bones Highland and Campazzo behind him. And they had sort of a rotating door, if you will, or a revolving door at that position. But this year, they're obviously getting Murray back. Traded Monte Morris to Washington. They got Ish Smith, who, as a scorer, might be a little bit worse. But I don't think he's a solid veteran. He's very limited in how he scores. Monte Morris is probably a better all-around scorer, but I don't think it matters as much. It's just a depth piece. There are two things that help the Nuggets. Number one, their offense is really run by Jokic most of the time. He's the lead facilitator and initiator for what they want to do on the offensive end. So it's not that big of a deal from that perspective. And number two, Murray's going to be back this season, we assume fully healthy, and he's going to be a big weapon for them as well. So they obviously got better at that position, getting a guy like Jamal Murray back, but I don't think they downgraded as much as people on that bench, getting a guy like Ish Smith, who's been in the league for a long time and will help them. One of the better moves of this offseason, as you mentioned, they traded Will Barton to Washington, but they got Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, and they signed him to a two-year contract extension, $3 million. And they also signed Bruce Brown, 2 years, $13 million. In addition to that, they also drafted Christian Braun with the 21st overall pick out of Kansas, a guy who's going to come in and I think play a somewhat bigger role than you think on this team right away because he's a guy that's going to defend on the perimeter. He's experienced, got a lot of experience at Kansas. He's already sort of developed into what he's going to be as an NBA player. He's a knockdown three-point shooter, and he's just a guy that's going to give them some solid minutes, I think. But I think, swapping Barton for Caldwell Pope is a huge upgrade. Caldwell Pope, still a dynamite defender on the perimeter, reliable shooter from downtown. I, as you said, go perfectly with what the Nuggets want to do on both ends of the floor. And then adding Bruce Brown, I think, is another thing that's going overlooked. He was a key cog for the Nets a lot of last year. They got him for the taxpayer mid-level exception, which I think might be highway robbery. It's one of the best value signings I saw this offseason. And, of course, getting not only Christian Braun, but Peyton Watson with the 30th pick overall. Those are another two guys. So they have really good depth now at that 2-3 guard, the wing position. And then obviously you go to their forwards. They traded Michael Green to Golden State, but Jeff Green exercised his player option. I don't really think there's not too much to discuss here. I think playing Porter at the 4 sometimes, MPJ, along with Aaron Gordon and Jeff Green, you can get by at that position with those players. That's solid. And obviously, behind Jokic, you go from DeMarcus Cousins to DeAndre Jordan. And I don't think, I'm not sure if that's a downgrade, but I think, Jordan still has something left to give this team. So while it's certainly not an upgrade, I don't think it's going to factor in too much. This team did get better because they're getting the guys back from in-house, but they also got some really solid role pieces for really affordable prices in the offseason. Sort of bargains, if you ask me. So, I think the Nuggets are going to be a team to be reckoned with.
Right.
I think you made a great point, might get off to a slow start, but they'll be I expect them to start hitting their stride like after Christmas, New Year's. Then we're going to start to see what this next team really is.
Exactly. Okay, moving along. Number 5 team, we have the Philadelphia 76ers. Man, where do we even start here? The Sixers made some pretty good moves this offseason. That point guard that I mentioned that they traded for from the Grizzlies, DeAnthony Melton, that's the name that I was thinking of. I think that's a really underrated move. He's a guy who defends extremely well, has improved his three-point shot year over year over the course of his career, and can also give some scoring punch. An underrated guy off the bench there. And, of course, the addition of P.J. Tucker as well. A guy who everywhere he has gone in this kind of late stint of his career, they've won. They've won games. And it's pretty clear the impact he brings. He's not going to fill up the stat sheet necessarily points-wise or anything like that, but he just makes winning plays. He's going to defend his butt off, hustle for loose balls, get rebounds, do everything you want from a veteran role player. And that toughness, I think, is what the 76ers have been missing. So I really give Daryl Morey a lot of credit in bringing him in a guy like that. This 76ers team, I think I mentioned this last year after the All-Star break when they played the Nets. After that James Harden trade, of course, they got blown out of the gym by the Nets at home. And obviously it's just a regular season game. It's not that big of a deal. But what I said after that game really held true throughout their playoff run. It was just they lack some intangible things within that team if you want to be a championship team. They don't hustle enough. They don't, they just look like they're kind of going through the motions out there sometimes, and they just rely so much on their talent. But I think if they can kind of instill, some of those hustle plays, some of those winning plays here and there, fighting for loose balls, not turning the ball over, some little things like that, I think that will be the difference in this team getting over the hump and finally getting to the conference finals and beyond. Um, and that obviously all starts with Joel Embiid, their perennial MVP candidate, who a lot of people think this might be his year to win MVP. Obviously, that will depend on his health, but I think it's fair to assume that. I mean, he's been incredible these last couple of years. And then James Harden, the hope is that he's healthy now and he's, rejuvenated. But as long as he can give you, elite playmaking, I think overall he'll be a positive to the team. Because that playmaking is kind of something they lack. That's one of the themes with this team also is he's basically their lone ball handler, a true point guard. So overall, I think this team is extremely interesting. They have a lot of pieces they need to move around and fit, but they're deeper than they were last year. And I think if things don't start off well at the beginning of the season, I think there are some moves that are available to them. For example, like possibly flipping Tobias Harris or possibly moving a draft pick here and there. I think this team has more open doors than they would have had a few years ago when they were really tied up to a lot of money.
Yeah, for sure. Last year was a whirlwind for the Sixers. They, of course, moved off Ben Simmons after that saga. They moved him to Brooklyn. They got James Harden. The bad news was at that time, Harden wasn't exactly having the greatest of seasons for Harden standards, and it cost them Seth Curry in the process, who was a valuable part of this team and what the Sixers were early on last season. But, they got to the playoffs. They beat the Raptors team in the first round in 6 games. But Doc Rivers, whoever, they left it in a little too long. He, of course, breaks a bone in his face, which greatly affected his availability and ability in the next series against the Miami Heat, where they ended up losing in 6 games. So a little bit of a disappointment there, but they got better this offseason. I really feel that. Of course, they're able to re-sign James Harden, 2 years, $68.6 million, and he sort of saved them some money, I even think, doing that. Not a huge change. Took a little bit of a pay cut. He, of course, has the player option for next year. So if he wants to, he can decline that option and sign the max if he has a good year. But, yeah, I think there's real no change there. They also have Tyrese Maxey back there, who I expected to get better, take it a little step forward. So I like that. And then you obviously mentioned trading a guy like Danny Green for DeAnthony Melton. I absolutely love the Melton pickup. It cost them David Roddy, first-round pick, who was a first-round pick, and Danny Green, who's, I believe, rehabbing a knee injury at this time. I think it was one of the better moves of the offseason. And they also brought in a guy that Daryl Morey likes in Daniel House Jr. for 2 years, $8 million. I think, familiar face, Daryl Morey, he's going to also help with the 3-and-D on the wing. And he has some good depth there off the bench. So I like what they did there. And then obviously, signing PJ Tucker, big one. They definitely improved. He's going to be a guy, that 3 years, $33 million. He's going to be 40 at the end of this deal, but I think he's still a guy who's going to be a massive upgrade in the short term, just in terms of his defensive intensity and ability to shoot from the corner, especially. I think that fits well with what Embiid's able to do, passing out of the post and the high post. And then, having Joel Embiid, who, if he's healthy, as we saw, is a legitimate MVP candidate. You can make the argument he should have won MVP last season. But they also brought in Montrezl Harrell, just a role guy. And as you mentioned, will bring, I think, some of the intangible things that have been missing from the Sixers team at times. So, yeah, I think they got better on the edges. I think they had one of the better off seasons in the league. Didn't do anything super splashy, but they really filled out this roster. It's deeper. It's better in a lot of different ways. As long as Embiid is healthy, which I think he will be, I think he's proven that he can stay healthy now. As long as you load manage him a little bit, the Sixers are going to be – they'll be one of the better teams in the East during the regular season. The question becomes, what is James Harden in the playoffs? But we're going to save that discussion for when we get there.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Our next team, I believe, is the Boston Celtics. Yes. Number 4 overall in our power rankings, the Boston Celtics. Coming off a finals appearance, lost in 6 games to the Golden State Warriors. Man, well, the headliner move of the offseason was obviously trading for Malcolm Brogdon, a ball handler, a guy who really gets it done on the defensive end, and also a former, 50, 40, 90 player. That's one of the rare feats in NBA history, and that can't be overlooked. He's had some injury troubles over the last few years, but I think the key with Brogdon is just load managing him, managing his minutes in the regular season, keeping him healthy for the playoffs when you need him. And then this team still has a lot of depth defensively, in particular. They the length of this team is what stands out to me. They're going to be missing their start defensive center Robert Williams for the first part of the season, I believe, with a knee injury. But they still have Al Horford, and the length of this starting lineup of Marcus Smart, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and then of course I think Grant Williams will probably move into the starting lineup, and then Al Horford. I think the amount of defensive versatility that they have in a variety of their different lineups that they can put out there is what makes this team so special and intriguing. Um, there are questions about their coaching situation at the moment, though. The situation with Ime Udoka is not ideal. If you hadn't heard, he had a. I'm not even going to get into the reason for why he was suspended. The fact is, he's suspended for the entire season. And in his place will be his assistant coach, filling in for this season, and he will be back next. And Ime Udoka will be back next season. But this is a team that's ready to win now, and the hope is that they won't skip a beat. But changing that voice in that locker room, changing that voice in that huddle in timeouts, it's a significant change in basketball. Maybe it's not in football or some other sports, but in basketball, that is very significant. And if there isn't that trust there between player and coach, there could be some problems. So that is a question, but I think this team is talented enough to where they'll still be a top 3 team in the East, in my opinion. And I think there is a good chance that, if the Celtics get off to a better start than they did last season, which won't take much, that Jason Tatum could be an MVP candidate.
Right. Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind is obviously the coaching situation. I just don't think there's any way that can't be a conversation right now. I think that it's going to have a little bit, at least a little bit of a negative impact. We don't know what this coach is that's stepping in for him. But yeah, I think Udoka played a huge role in their success last year. And I think they really played for him, and there were a lot of different factors there. But I do think that's a question going into the season. But look, this roster is ready to win. They're ready to win now. Obviously, got to the finals last year after a subpar start, like Imy mentioned. They were 3 games under 500, entering the 40th game of the season, about the halfway point. They just weren't looking like they're going to be too much of a factor in the Eastern Conference. Maybe they make the playoffs, make the play-in tournament, who knows? But then they flipped the switch. And in the final 43 games of the regular season, they played about as dominant of basketball as you can play. They over that span, those 43 games, kind of like the Mavericks, but to a bigger extent.
Right.
They were 33-10. They had the second best offense in the league in terms of offensive rating in those 43 games. And they were by far the most dominant defense in that span, by 4.1 points per 100 possessions better than the next best team. Their plus 13.5 net rating during that span doubled the Phoenix Suns in that time period. Phoenix 7.2. And then Boston 13.5. So they were just absolutely terrorizing the entire league. They went on a run. They got to the finals. They ran to Golden State, and the question became, Jason Tatum, of course, didn't have his best series, but they brought in Derek White. They brought in some pieces last year. They didn't have the guard. That extra guard that they needed in that backcourt to create shots, but also help Marcus Smart on the defensive end and do a lot of these facilitating duties. And now they have that in Malcolm Brogdon. Obviously, they're going to be missing Robert Williams for a certain period of time, but they've dealt with that before. I think they have good guys who can step in. I do think they got better, obviously, bringing in a quality player like Malcolm Brogdon. They just didn't have quite enough in that backcourt last year. They went out and got Brogdon. They just need to find a way to keep all these guards healthy. All of them have injury histories. Marcus Smart, Malcolm Brogdon, and Derek White. So it'll be interesting to see how they go that. But I think by getting Brogdon, you can lighten the load on him because you have those other guys. So I think they're arguably still top to bottom with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown now sort of figuring it out. I still think they're ahead of schedule in terms of where they are as a team. Getting to the finals last year was certainly an accomplishment. I think you can make the argument top to bottom, they're the best roster in the East, but it has to have Robert Williams healthy. I still think, my biggest question for them is the coaching situation and how that's going to impact them. But otherwise, I mean, if Jason Tatum's like an MVP level player, which we know he can, and Jaylen Brown's that second player with Brogdon and Marcus Smart, then they're going to be a very formidable team in the Eastern Conference and the finals contender most likely.
Right, exactly. Okay, moving on to our number 3 team in the NBA. Have the Los Angeles Clippers. This is probably the team I'm most intrigued to watch, or one of the teams I'm most intrigued to watch going into this season. There are a few on that list, but the Clippers are bringing Kawhi back, obviously, but it goes beyond that. They made a few trades last year to the edges of the roster that really might make the difference with the addition of Kawhi. Bringing in a guy like Norman Powell and obviously Robert Covington, who now will enter a position where they can be in a support role rather than a focal point offensively. And obviously Norman Powell, a guy who Kawhi is already familiar with, having played with him in Toronto and winning a championship with him. So on top of that, they also brought in John Wall, a guy who has already said like he's ready to, step into a facilitative point guard role and buy in defensively, which is really all you really need from a guy like John Wall. He's a guy who has the experience, he knows what he's doing, and if it comes to a point where you do need some extra scoring punch, he can bring that as well. So this team is fantastic. As much as I have, had my gripes about them in the past, and I guess not really gripes. It's more so just some distaste for them. Just being a Mavericks fan, it came naturally. But even for me, you just can't deny that this team is deep at every position. And some of the questions that they even had before when Kawhi was healthy, when they were contending with playmaking and you know, and for to some extent, wing depth, that's all really been answered. And I'm really excited to see what this team can do. It really comes down to health and um, really just gelling. We really don't know how many games Kawhi will play. We know that he's always going to be load managing, but they have to be able to manage that and also be able to play him in enough games to where they get that chemistry.
Right. My This might sound silly, but my biggest question for the Clippers is, are they going to overcome themselves? It always seems like, and this dates back in their franchise history quite a while, all the way back to like the Danny Manning, Ron Harper days, to of course the unfulfilled era, which we got to witness: Chris Paul, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan. They just have a snake bit in history and a lack of enduring respectability for whatever reason, whether that's injuries or just being overshadowed by another team in their own city, the Lakers, to just not things going wrong at different points in times. So, of course, health is a huge question, but we don't need to, talk about that because that's already sort of known commodity, if you will. They obviously, top to bottom, I mean, this is one of the best in the league. You obviously have Kawhi, who, let's be honest, if he has his body right, he's arguably a top 5 player in the league, top 10 player for sure, who impacts the game, on both ends. But I think the underrated part about Kawhi is he's clutch. He comes up big in big moments. Paul George, who's, of course, when he's right, one of the league's premier two-way players. He's stretching his prime well into his 30s, and he's showing no real signs of decline or rust, so that's good for him. They bring in John Wall, who's sort of explored with the ball, shows of what he can be last year in Houston. And I think he'll bring a certain thing that they've been missing in terms of just his burst, his change of speed, his ability to knock down shots. I think he's improved his jumper. He'll certainly be searching for a level of validation coming off his injuries, showing that he can contribute. Marcus Morris, steady spot up 3-point shooter. He can be streaky, but he's dangerous. And then Zubac, who I think is not talked about enough or given enough credit. He's the screen setter. He does the dirty work. He's really reliable at the 5 spot. But I think the most important thing we have to talk about is the fact that, Norman Powell is going to be a very solid all-around swingman. I think at points in times you're going to see him push for starters minutes. And he'll blend in super well defensively next to Paul George and Kawhi Leonard. And then you also add in Robert Covington, who can space the floor and also bring some perimeter defense. So they're not lacking for perimeter defense or shooting for that matter. They have their star players. It's just going to be, as you said, health. I think they have the depth that you need. Moving Reggie Jackson to the bench now will certainly help. Luke Kennard is another sharpshooter. 45% of his three-pointers went in last season. There's really nothing to dislike about the Clippers, but as I said, it's just going to be a matter of overcoming themselves. So we'll dive deeper into them at a later date, but yeah, they're certainly going to be a team to watch.
Right. And one last thing is their coach is another part of this team I feel great about. Tyronn Lue,
Absolutely.
someone who's won a championship and showed last year and really the last couple of years that he is probably a top 5, top 10 coach in the league. No doubt about it.
Absolutely. He's one of those guys who's been there, done that. But we'll move on to the Milwaukee Bucks. So why don't you start us off with our number 2 team in the league? And you could probably guess, based on what we've done so far, who the number 1 team is. But the Milwaukee Bucks, what do you think?
Yeah. With Milwaukee, it starts and ends with Giannis, obviously. But I just really like how they always commit to their defensive scheme. And they really found a formula that works in the regular season. And now these past couple years has worked in the playoffs as well, which is defending the rim, committing to defending the rim with their 2 rim protectors in Giannis and Brook Lopez, and also using Giannis as sort of a free safety type of player, as a help defender in the opposite side, using him to come over and destroy anything that really comes near the rim. And that has really committing to that has really paid dividends for this defense. And with Brook Lopez injured for most of last year, Giannis playing that role really was the main reason they were able to stay afloat defensively. But this year, they have Brook Lopez back healthy. And obviously, Chris Middleton back healthy as well, hopefully. A month or 2 into the season, I think he'll be back. And this team, they're quietly, I think, the favorite to be the number 1 seed in the East. I think they're the team you look at and you're like, okay, they won a championship. You can trust them because there are some teams in the East where you go, they haven't proven to be quite as consistent as this Bucks team. They're deep. They have shooters up and down the roster. That's one of the things that they've really emphasized these last couple of years, bringing in shooting around Giannis, which has really helped their cause. I think Grayson Allen could be in a position to do more this year. Obviously, he's a controversial player, but say what you want about him, he's a important part of that roster. I just think this Bucks team, they know who they are. They're basically bringing back the same roster, and that goes a long way, especially in the regular season. Knowing your identity, knowing what you want to do offensively and defensively, that helps you win close games.
Yeah. I think this is a team that internally, and of course, we're not reporters. We're not in the organization. We don't have connections, but this is a team that believes that if it weren't for Chris Middleton being hurt, they probably would have beaten Boston, and they would have possibly gone on to defend their championship or at least get to the finals, I think. I think that's what they fully believe. Had they been healthy, they would have defended their championship. You hit it right on the head. I think, at the guard positions, you have Drew Holiday, who had a solid year last year, will continue to do that. But I think re-signing Javon Carter to 2 years, $4.3 million on a really solid deal for what he can provide. I think you're going to see another good season from Holiday, but getting a contribution off the bench from George Hill, a veteran guy, and then a younger guy in Javon Carter. They have depth at every position. You look at, Chris Middleton, obviously a huge question is his health. But I think if he's healthy, you sign Pat Connaughton to a contract extension, you re-sign Wesley Matthews, you re-sign Jordan Nora, and you also, in sort of a move that I think went under the radar, got Joe Ingles. Now he's coming off an ACL injury, but if he can come back from that ACL injury and be effective, then I love his addition to this team. He's a great playmaker and another shooter that they could use. You can never have enough shooters in today's NBA. Bringing back Wesley Matthews on the minimum, I think, was a solid move. And I think the contract extension, 3 years, $28 million for Pat Connaughton, was good value. So they're deep at that wing position. I really have no concerns there other than Chris Middleton's health. Obviously, Giannis is going to continue to get better, which is scary. He's going to be in an MVP conversation pretty much every year as long as he doesn't get hurt. He's just an alien, if you will. But, re-signing Bobby Portis was also another move that they made, keeping this core together. 4 years, $48 million. And then you still have Brook Lopez, who's going to be healthier this year. And, of course, bringing back Serge Ibaka on a minimum contract as well. So it's basically the same team. If they get a healthy Joe Ingles, if Javon Carter can sort of take another step, some of these other pieces take, another step, and they stay healthy, well, they're going to be – it's the Milwaukee Bucks. I mean, it's with Giannis, Chris Middleton, Drew Holiday. They're going to be a contender. So I expect big things from Milwaukee. But we'll just have to see how it plays out through the regular season and what the health of this team looks like come the postseason.
Right, exactly. It really starts and ends with Giannis in terms of why they're up so high, and they've shown what they can do before, and they've won a championship. There's a reason for that, and I think they have as good a roster as any in the league by all accounts. Okay, moving on to our last team, the defending champ, Golden State Warriors at number 1. This was a no-brainer. I'll just start by saying, man, this team, I've never seen a team be able to pull off, going with partially all in and partially bringing young talent along. I've never seen that be able to be pulled off the way the Warriors did last year. And, not only did they do it, but they also were able to do it to where they were able to get contributions from those young guys in the playoffs, which is a bonus. Give them, that valuable playoff experience and then win a championship all on top of it. So now this season, you have another offseason of work from all of those young guys. You bring back James Wiseman. You also bring in Dante DiVincenzo. This roster is, man, it's as good as any of this, entire Warriors era, including those Kevin Durant teams. Because some of those teams in that Durant era were very shallow. If you remember, they kind of had to sacrifice some of their depth from the early championship runs in order to bring in Kevin Durant. And I think this roster is just absolutely incredible. Man, I just think Klay Thompson, you have more time. He has more time of getting his legs under him. And I think the more time passes, the more he will get back to being himself. And it's just scary. This roster is just scary. There's no other way to put it.
Yeah, there were some, training camp got a little heated the other
Right.
day. Draymond Green and Jordan Poole got into a scrum, if you will. I think they're getting that sorted out right now. But I think, it can't be understated the importance. I don't think people ever understand the importance of a guy like Draymond Green and what his role is on this team and how important he is to the Golden State Warriors. But yeah, you obviously have Draymond, who I believe is in the contract year, if I'm not mistaken.
I think.
I believe so. I'm like 95% sure. So we'll have to fact check that for our next episode. But Curry, I think a huge thing is Klay Thompson having another off season, a full off season to get his bearings under him. You have the Splash Brothers, and I love the point you made about the younger guys on this roster having a chance to contribute and go through that playoff run once. So now, coming into this season, you expect that maturation process and development to continue. So yeah, all around this team, I'm interested to see what they can get out of James Wiseman, or if he potentially might become a trade asset at some point. Jordan Poole is obviously a guy who is looking, played really well last season, provided some firepower off the bench. He'll continue to play a critical role. I think Moses Moody is going to be an important piece of this team just in terms of what he can do. I don't think we've really seen much of him yet, but I think we're going to see more of him this year. So yeah, it's been incredible what Joe Lacob and that front office has been able to do. I believe they have one of the higher payrolls in the league, if not the highest payroll in the league. But they've also supplemented that with these young players, and that's how you have to do it. They drafted and developed guys. They brought in some young talent from other teams. I mean, it's one of the better, run organizations in sports, I think we can say at this point. And there's no reason to think that, barring a major injury to a key player, that they're not going to try to defend their title once again.
Yeah, I think they have to be the favorites in the West. Obviously, repeating is pretty rare in the world of sports and obviously in the NBA as well. But man, I mean, this team, it's hard to deny that this roster is clearly better. Not just on paper, but they also are going to be improved from within as well, which really gives me confidence. It's not just bringing in pieces from outside, which can sometimes be hit or miss. It's also just continuing to grow within the core with guys that you already have in house who know the system, who already have that chemistry, and this Warriors team is just going to continue to churn out great seasons. It's inevitable.
Yeah, so I think our next NBA podcast is where we're gonna go into the Eastern Conference, and we're gonna either project how we see the playoffs and the play-in playing out, and how we see the seedings playing out, or we'll be doing some over/under stuff. One of the two, but we're gonna do our Eastern Conference and our Western Conference like we do every year. So those were our power rankings. I think it's a good list. There's obviously some teams that we didn't acknowledge on this episode that you could make an argument for, of course, I think. But I think since we're about an hour 20 in right now, we'll do 10, 15 minutes of overreactions. We don't really have a ton of time. And then we'll wrap this up, and we're going to be doing another episode for the baseball playoffs.
Yeah, so I think for the sake of keeping this episode under wraps, we'll limit it to one or two teams each. And I'll just get right into mine. One of the big takeaways for me so far in the preseason has been the New Orleans Pelicans. They went into Chicago the other day and absolutely thumped the Chicago Bulls. But it wasn't the fact that they did it; it's how they looked doing it. Um, Zion had, I believe, 21 points in 20 minutes. I think only missed 2 shots from the field. The ball movement was fantastic. Um, and the bench as well stuck out to me in that second quarter. Um, the bench went into the game. The lineup of Jose Alvarado, Herb Jones, who is a starter, but in this case, for the sake of this argument, it was with the bench unit. Um, and then I believe it was Jackson Hayes, Larry Nance Jr., um, and I forget who they had at that 2 spot, but it was Garrett Temple. That group coming off that bench, I think it really just showcased how deep that team really is. And I think Willie Green um, is a reason for me to have confidence in that team as well. That style of play, of ball movement, if they can, commit to defending, that team has an extremely high ceiling, as high a ceiling as any in the Western Conference.
Yeah, Pelicans are really interesting. We're going to talk about them for sure in our Western Conference episode. I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't watched much of the preseason, but what I can tell you is number one, I have one like bigger picture looking into the future overreaction, and then I have one like just obscure overreaction I have from watching one of the games that I happened to be watching was a Celtics game, and I think watching Sam Hauser and what he's able to provide the Celtics team. He's a guy out of Virginia who I watched a lot of in college. Sharpshooter that has already sort of garnered a connection with Malcolm Brogdon and some of the guards there. He's another guy that's going to add to what that Celtics roster already is. And I think when you look at some of the struggles Marcus Smart has had shooting from the perimeter at times, or Derek White at times is more of a streaky guy. Sam Hauser, his ability to stretch the floor but also play multiple positions, could be a guy by the end of the season you say, oh, that guy, he really helped them win. But that's a more obscure just observation more than an overreaction, I think. Man, I don't know if you have watched you've been watching this G League stuff, but Victor Wembanyama, man, I don't know what to think at this point. I am already super
invested.
Invested, not only because of the outlook of my Spurs this year and wanting to get the number 1 pick potentially. Not only the number 1 pick, but the number 2 pick, because the guy behind him in any other year, Scoot Henderson, would probably be the number 1 overall pick.
Right.
But Wembanyama, just watching him play, I mean, LeBron James spoke very highly of him. Quote, everybody's been a unicorn over the last few years, but he's more like an alien. No one has ever seen anyone as tall as he is, but as fluid and as graceful as he is out on the floor. His ability to put the ball on the floor, shoot step-back jumpers out of the post, catch and shoot threes, block shots. He's for sure a generational type talent. Adrian Wojnarowski was on ESPN today talking about. He said, this guy is potentially the best prospect, all-around prospect that we've ever seen in the NBA, in NBA history for that matter, and could increase the valuation of the franchise that gets him by over $500 million if he pans out. I'm just fascinated by Victor Wembanyama. And as a Spurs fan, I'm going to be even more fascinated following this tanking for Wembanyama, because if you think about it, he is French. And over the years, the Spurs like their French guys. So we'll see what happens. 7-4, basically Kevin Durant is what I see when I watch him play. But yeah, I don't know, man. I just don't know what to think of him. You can certainly see it. He's generational.
Yeah,
What do you think?
it's clear as day. You know, it's hard to really say after one game.
Yeah,
Uh, it's obviously
I
that's
get
why
it.
this segment is called Overreactions. But um, it wasn't the fact that he dropped 37. It was the way he did it. It it's not every day that you see a 7-4 guy bring the ball up the floor on a fast break, catch lobs, shoot threes, um, have a wide arsenal of moves in the post at 18 years old, a floater, a hook shot, fadeaways. I mean,
He's got
the
everything.
polish of his game, the handle, everything about his game is NBA ready. I think if the rule was already set to where you could go straight into the NBA out of high school, he would have been the number one overall pick in this draft. No questions asked, not even close. Um, yeah, it feels like we're jumping the gun here if you haven't seen him play, but I encourage you guys. We're not crazy. Like we're in the majority here in terms of people that have watched him play. Um, it's pretty clear.
Yeah. And the guy right behind him, Scoot Henderson, I mean, he's a great consolation prize for whoever gets the second overall pick. I just think. And then there are other guys in college right now that are, of course, going to show themselves over the course of the college basketball season that will be right behind. I think next year's draft is going to be absolutely wild. But yeah, Victor Wembanyama, man, we obviously want to see more. It's probably unfair at this point to pin the expectations of, you know, greatest prospect of all time and this and
Yeah,
that, and he's going to be this and he's going to be that. But I mean, stats can lie, numbers can lie, but people's eyes often don't lie,
yeah.
and it's easy to see, man. It's just super easy to see. Do you have one thing you want to say before we wrap this thing up? One more
Well,
overreaction.
my one other overreaction was about the Brooklyn Nets. Ben Simmons, he's going to bring what we thought he would bring when they acquired him. A guy who can play make, push the ball in transition. People like really um, talk a lot about his lack of a jump shot, and that it is important, but Ben Simmons is exactly what this Brooklyn Nets team needs. He's 6'10" and can guard all five positions. That's not just taught me talking him up. He can legitimately guard all five positions, and that's what's really going to take a lot of pressure off of Kevin Durant, who was forced to guard a lot of centers when he really shouldn't have been asked to do that. Um, I think I'm sold on Ben Simmons having a bounce back year, me personally, and that's definitely I'm definitely in the minority on that. I understand that there's reason to have doubt. There's reason to question whether he'll be able to stay healthy, but listening to the JJ Redick interview he went on to the JJ Redick podcast and kind of cleared the air, talked about kind of his mindset going into the season. And that really kind of reassured me and kind of confirmed that what I saw on the court in that preseason game wasn't just a blip.
That's interesting. I'll have to listen to that podcast, and see what he had to say. But I think I'm certainly not going to disagree with you, but I haven't watched enough or seen enough to know what he's been
Right.
doing in the preseason. So I'm not going to really speak on it yet. I certainly could see it. There's obviously a world where he is the Ben Simmons we saw. What was it, 2 or 3 years ago? The guy that comes in is makes a huge impact defensively, but is also that facilitator and can score at points in times and fit in with Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant. He'll fit in perfectly. We've talked about that ad nauseum if he's on the court. So yeah, I think we'll talk more about the Nets and the Ben Simmons situation soon, but that is going to do it. We'll probably have more overreactions, more time for overreactions in a later podcast, but yeah, it's going to do it for this episode.
Yeah, guys, thanks for watching. Like and subscribe. I forgot to say it earlier again. I always forget to say it at the beginning of the podcast, but like and subscribe, share it with your friends. We really appreciate the support recently. We've actually been getting a good amount of views on our past few podcasts, so we really appreciate that. And I'll let Michael sign us off here.
Just like the not lack of content on this channel over the next month, we are gone.
That made sense.